Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at the Mach Studios F-22A Raptor. Many of you may be familiar with Mach Studios' freeware version of the aircraft. They've now released a payware version of the Raptor, offering up some significant improvements. The Mach Studios F-22A certainly isn't designed to be a study level rendition of the aircraft, and obviously that would be pretty difficult anyway, with the aircraft still being highly classified. In terms of systems fidelity, I would say that the Mach F-22 sits somewhere between the likes of DC Designs and India Fox Teco. So a pretty easy aircraft to get stuck into, and a pretty good option as well for beginners if you want to try a hand at flying a fast jet in the sim. The lack of systems fidelity though certainly doesn't allude to a lack of quality. The F-22 is a very nice offering overall, and we'll obviously be taking a look at that in today's video. We're going to be carrying out a full review of the aircraft, as I'm sure it's one many of you are interested in. For those of you new to the channel, that means we're going to take a look at both the external modelling and texturing. We'll do the same internally, and we'll also discuss any additional features of the aircraft that may be unique to the F-22. We're going to be more or less carrying out a full flight all the way through from a cold and dark start, and in general I'll try and give you a comprehensive feel of what the product has to offer. In terms of our flight today, we're currently on the ground at Nellis Air Force Base, just outside of Las Vegas. And you may well have noticed the SU57 parked just behind our Raptor. That hopefully gives you some idea as to what we're going to be doing today. The plan for our flight, we're going to depart out of Nellis, head out towards Lake Mead. We're not going to be putting the aircraft into a straight dogfight, since I'll be pre-recording the first profile. However, we are going to be carrying out some fairly aggressive tail chasing over Lake Mead between the two aircraft, hopefully to give us a pretty good feel as to how manoeuvrable the F-22 actually is. With that done, we'll return to Nellis, just a couple more manoeuvres there on the way home. And then at the end of the video, as always, I'll give you my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. As always guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. You can probably see for yourselves already that Mach Studios have put quite a lot of nice attention to detail into the F-22. So let's continue our tour of the external model of the aircraft. So as I say, I think Mach Studios have done a very nice job with the jet. Certainly, in a broad sense, the aircraft appears to look the part, and there are lots of nice details that we'll take a look at as we work our way around the jet. As we've all really come to expect at this point from a Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on, there are various fixtures and fittings on the external of the aircraft that we can choose to add or remove. Namely, we get chocks, engine intake covers, as well as various other external covers, external fuel tanks, and as you can see, a nice little addition, we also have a cover there for the heads-up display. Model detailing is generally very good. Here we're looking up into the weapons bay at an AIM-9 Sidewinder. And the F-22 does come with visually modelled weapons, although worth mentioning, as always, if you do purchase the aircraft from the in-sim marketplace, then the weapons will be removed. There are just a couple of areas externally which are a little bit lower in poly count. You may notice those throughout the flight, but generally speaking, again, detail very good. The same goes with texturing. Generally the aircraft does look very nice, although you can see though there, for example, with the squadron livery, that's a little bit low resolution. Plenty of high resolution details as well though, here looking at the nose wheel tyre, as well as the nose wheel pin, and we're also looking up into the weapons bay at 6 AIM-120s. As we already spoke about during the introduction, the aircraft is by no means study level, but there are still quite a lot of nice features included. Here we can see that the APU inlet and exhaust are operable, and the same goes for the air-to-air refuelling inlet. Further to that, we can also dump fuel on the F-22 at a rate of around £1,000 a minute. And lastly, just getting the engines running for this particular demonstration, but the F-22 of course features thrust vectoring, so pretty unique in the sim at the moment. I have to say, very nice, smooth animations there on both the flight controls and indeed the vectored nozzles. And worth noting here, the nozzles do work in the correct sense. You'll notice during my video later on, there will be some shots where the nozzles don't appear to work correctly. That's purely as a result of the replay tool that I'll be using to shoot some of the video here, so no worries on that front. The cockpit of the F-22 looks very nice as well. Here you can see we have an optional ladder. Again, you can see the cover there on the heads-up display. The pilot's generally modelled very nicely, well textured. It would have been nice though to see a little bit of animation there, perhaps a little bit of head movement. The pilot is very much a static model, and that does somewhat slightly reduce the otherwise very realistic look of the F-22. You'll see later on, but at certain angles the aircraft really does look quite photorealistic. Anyway, the cockpit does indeed look very nice, so let's now head for the cockpit and we'll take a closer look at some of the various controls and systems. Internally, the F-22 looks every bit as good as it does externally. Again, not a study level aircraft, but there is enough there, I would say, to give you an immersive and enjoyable experience. Much like the F-16 and the F-35, the F-22 has excellent visibility. You'll see that throughout the flight. Looking down then at the left console, again, very nice modelling, very nice texturing. Everything's pretty immaculate, and I really like the colouring and the general style of the texturing there as well. Generally speaking, the cockpit doesn't look quite photorealistic per se. I would say that some of the textures have that slightly more painted vibe to them. In terms of the aircraft systems, the F-22 by its very nature doesn't have a ton of controls and switches in the cockpit. Of what is there in the cockpit, I would say around 50% of the switches are working, but I think it would be fair to add that many of the systems behind those switches are somewhat simplified. And as you'll see in just a moment's time when we get the aircraft started up, the Top Mach Studios F-22 is once again a fairly simplified version of the aircraft. Detailing in the cockpit is again really nice, even looking at the more hidden away areas here behind the pilot's seat. There's clearly still a very nice level of attention to detail, and once again they're highlighting just how excellent visibility generally is in the F-22. Anyway, a large number of the Raptor systems are controlled via the multi-function displays, which you may have seen just a moment ago. Just before we head into our flight, we'll briefly run through those MFDs, the available functionality, and again we'll take a look at the general level of fidelity. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of the F-22A's multi-function flight displays, we have one primary flight display, and we have three secondary flight displays, one down below as well. The secondary flight displays can be used to cycle through various systems pages. So for example here we're on the engines page. You can use the page to start the aircraft's engines. That can also be done in two alternate ways. There's a quick start as well as controls down on the main instrument panel, which we'll take a look at later on. Further to that, we can also check out the aircraft's hydraulic system. Coming up to menu, you can see we do have the various subsystems. So we firstly have the engines page. Secondly, we have the control position synoptic page. And as you can see there, that gives us our various flight control positions, as well as trims, centre of gravity, flaps, spoilers, things of that nature. Onto the moving map display, as you might expect, that brings up the navigation display. Coming back down to menu, next onto the stores loadout page. And again, as one might expect, here it shows the aircraft stores on board. So we have our two AIM-9s, as well as our 6 AIM-120s. Again, those weapons are not deployable, they're just visually modelled, although they do also add weight to the aircraft. And from this page we can also operate the weapons doors, which we saw during the external walk-around. Next we have our fuel page, and again, as you might expect, that shows the aircraft's various fuel tanks, as well as the total fuel on board. And again, as we saw during the external walk-around, the F-22 can also be fitted with external tanks, although we won't be running those for the flight today. Lastly, we have the config page, and as discussed, that gives us our various options for the moving map display, so we can turn the terrain on and off, same for the traffic, and same for the range rings. So there is a little bit of functionality there in terms of the information the F-22A can display to the pilot. Of course, the fidelity is toned down quite somewhat, really in line with the rest of the product. Moving on to the primary multifunction display, again we have options for the moving map display that can also be selected on the center screen. Most interesting options here though, if we go to config and then to sim, we can set up the various equipment on the aircraft that again you'll have seen during the external walk around. So per flight we can remove the aircraft's chocks, the various protective covers for the pitot tubes, static ports, HUD, things of that nature, as well as the ladder. There's also the option to add or remove a telemetry device and a tow bar, which I haven't looked at myself here today. On the next page, we can also remove the aircraft weapons, and again bear in mind that if you do purchase the aircraft from the marketplace, then the weapons will be removed by default and unavailable. On the persistent options page, as the name would suggest, here we can set the persistent state for the aircraft. Essentially this governs the options which load in each time we start a flight with the F-22. It's a reasonable system, although it does mean if you want to make any changes you will have to restart the flight, which can be a little bit laborious. But we can choose to start the aircraft cold and dark with the chocks, cold and dark with the RBF items, so again the protective covers, cold and dark with the ladder, and lastly cold and dark with the pilot visible. Again you can also opt to install the telemetry device. Onto page 2, and here we have the drop tanks fully disabled. As you'll have seen during the walk around, we can fit the external tanks as mentioned. But again, if you want to add or remove the drop tanks, you're actually going to have to restart the flight. Just be aware of that. And lastly, you can choose to persistently start the aircraft with the weapons removed. So a nice set of options there, I think, with the F-22. Again, it has been made fairly user-friendly there, a little bit dumbed down versus the real-world aircraft. But firstly, of course, the product is not trying to be study level, and secondly, of course, the F-22 is still highly classified, so it's very unlikely that Top Mac would have been able to find all that much information on the aircraft's avionics at any rate. Anyway, that just about completes our overview of the aircraft's externals and internals, so about time we see what it's like up in the air, I think. We'll get ourselves strapped in, and then we'll begin running through the startup process. So, welcome to the cockpit of the F-22. We've now got ourselves strapped in, and we've also just removed the ladder from the aircraft, so we are now ready for the start. The startup process in the aircraft is pretty straightforward, the checklists are pretty brief, and that's not necessarily a criticism. Again, it is just the level of fidelity that the product is aiming to model. So for the startup process, generators are both off, battery master can go on. We need to fire up the APU. That only takes a few seconds, around 10 seconds in total. So we'll just wait for that to come online. APU is now available, so we'll come down to the engines page. We need to hit control. And as discussed before, there is a quick start option. We can also start the engines entirely using the multifunction display. Or we can also use the engine controls down here on the side console. We'll run through the hybrid startup process. We'll start the number 1 engine first, so the engine fuel pump can go on. And same for the ignition. You can only start the engines, worth noting, once you have all of the external fixtures and fittings removed, for example the ladder and the chocks. Anyway, we have the fuel pump on, ignition is on. We'll just come down to our lights, and we'll set our position and anti-collision lights on. And to engage the starter, we'll come down to the engine control panel, we'll go to left on the FADEC, and we can hit motor. Right, so we do have a good start there on the left engine. We'll carry out the same process for the right engine. So once again, fuel pump can go on, same for the ignition. Come down to the engine control panel, we'll go to right FADEC, and we'll hit motor. And just monitoring the engine there as it spools up. Interestingly, we get fuel flow before we actually get rotation on the engine. I'm not sure how accurate or not that is to the real-world F-22. But you can see that the spool up time is quite nice and slow, fairly realistic I would imagine. Okay, so oil pressure coming up, ITT coming up, we have a good light off, fuel flows come up as well, and we are now showing rotation there. So we're just waiting for around 25% before the engine's stable. Looks like the SU57 is just taxiing off to the active runway. He'll be departing out before us, we'll be joining him overhead Lake Mead. So we do have a good start there on the number 2, the generator can go on, APU can come off. Lights are set as required, we'll close up the canopy in just a moment, we'll just follow the SU57 here as he taxis out towards the holding point. So he's momentarily holding short, we'll close up the canopy. And just like the F-16 and the F-35, the F-22 has one of these canopies that I absolutely love. So the canopy's closed, SU57 still holding short. It would have been nice there to have some sounds associated with the canopy. Anyway, he's just departing. We'll carry out a quick flight control check. Nose light can go to taxi, park brake can come off, and we'll make our way out towards the runway. The aircraft feels good in terms of the taxi. Nose wheel steering feels pretty reasonable. Looks like we've actually got a slight tailwind here off runway 21. So we'll just hold short until the SU57's departed. He should get his clearance momentarily. So off he departs out towards the southwest. And as I say, he'll be heading out towards Lake Mead. We'll join him in just a moment's time. Leaving a big old trail of black smoke behind him as he goes. So we are clear for takeoff. Landing light can go on. We're all clear on final. We'll get ourselves into position here on runway 21. 21 right in this particular case. We can quite happily take off with full military power here in the F-22. We've got an abundance of power with the engines, but we're going to take off in full afterburner here. Mainly for show, and of course it's a bit more fun as well. So getting ourselves lined up. And holding the aircraft on the brakes. We'll come up to full military power on the brakes. And off the brakes, into the afterburner. Already up through 140 knots, back on the stick. And airborne, the gear can come up. Up through 300 knots, we'll come out of afterburner. And we'll start tracking out towards the south, making our way out towards Lake Mead. Okay, so we're just coming overhead Lake Mead, up at 15,000 feet. More or less full dry military power for now, maintaining around 600 knots or just below. We should have the SU57 somewhere off the nose. We'll be meeting up with him somewhere over the narrowest point of the lake here, so keeping a good visual lookout for now. Of course, in reality, we'd probably lock him up on the radar with the F-22, but that's not an option here on the top Mach Studios version of the aircraft. So just using the Mark 1 eyeball for now. Always a little bit tricky in the sim to actually visually spot aircraft. There he is, just off the left. So fight's on.
Please got your visual of your right wing passing right now. I don't have to smoke.
Okay, so he's just ending the fight there. I have to say that was pretty good fun overall. Obviously not to the same level of fidelity as something like DCS, but nonetheless good fun. And certainly, as usual in the sim, the graphical fidelity pretty much second to none. I will say there was quite a lot of buffeting there during the flight. That does seem to be an issue with the aircraft. That is written up in the manual. Apparently it's a hard-coded issue in the sim that Top Max Studios unfortunately can't do too much about. So pulling any high G there, quite a lot of buffeting from the aircraft. It's a little bit distracting. Anyway, we'll slot in here by the SU57. He's heading back towards Nellis, inbound for the landing. We're going to hold off on the landing. We'll carry out one more manoeuvre before we get the aircraft back down on the ground. Still got about 7,000 pounds of fuel on board. Burning our way, quite low back on the throttle at the moment, but burning our way through about 10,000 pounds of fuel an hour. Probably got about 20 minutes of endurance left in the aircraft. Anyway, he's going back onto runway 27 left. We'll come back up to full military power. Get ourselves up to around 10,000 feet. We'll gain a little bit of altitude here. We're going to try a flat spin here in the F-22. That's obviously one of the aircraft's party pieces, and Top Max Studios have actually managed to model that in the sim, which is pretty impressive. So I'll show you that in just a moment's time. Come all the way up onto the afterburners. And just getting the last little bit of our altitude here, coming over the top of the loop. We want to bleed off all of our speed here as we come through the loop. So coming over the top, closing the throttle. We'll just use G here to bleed off the rest of that speed. There's Nellis just down below us, so coming all the way back on the stick. And you can see we're pretty much hanging in the air at this point. Go full right rudder and full right aileron. Apparently the aileron is a bit of a workaround here in the sim, just to help get the aircraft through the turn. But as you can see, the aircraft will actually flat spin. A manoeuvre I'm sure many of you have seen the F-22 perform at various air shows over the years. And it's pretty impressive. It's good fun as well. Just get ourselves down to around 7,000 feet and then we'll recover. So we'll start the recovery in just a moment's time. Just coming through 7,000 feet. So we'll come back into full afterburner. Power out of the manoeuvre here. You can see it does take quite a bit of altitude to recover. And speed just coming up 350 knots, so back into normal flight. And up through 200, we'll come back off the afterburner. Down to around 5,000 pounds of fuel now on board. So we'll get the F-22 back on the ground, fairly sharpish here. Coming off of being the threshold of runway 21, so we'll just make a bit of a left-hand downwind to come back for an arrival onto 21 right. We'll track outbound momentarily. We'll keep a nice tight circuit here. So again, really interesting, fun little flight model in the F-22. Minus the buffeting, it's a really enjoyable aircraft to fly. Very manoeuvrable as well, of course. I think the SU57 actually had us somewhat beat on manoeuvrability, but in terms of raw power and speed, we definitely had the Felon bang to rights on that. Anyway, we'll start turn inbound. We'll just use some G here to bleed off some of the speed. And speed good, we'll take the gear down. And we'll just take the speed brakes here as well, just to lose those final few knots. We'll get our speed down to around 160 knots as we come down final approach. So good there now on the speed, we can stay the speed brakes. And coming up on the throttles. Okay, so coming down final approach around 160 knots, we've got the gear down, 3 greens. Just keeping that flight path vector slightly below the touchdown zone for now. We're a little bit high on the approach. And we've obviously got a bit of a crosswind out from the left here. You can see the nose being pushed out to the left. So we'll have to decrab the aircraft just before we touch down. Speed's good. We'll cut the throttles, just checking back on the stick. And a little bit of right rudder. There's touchdown. Slightly sensitive on the rudder there on touchdown. Come onto the brakes, start lowering the nose onto the runway. And a little bit of abrupt derotation there on my part. Anyway, we'll come onto the brakes a little bit more firmly now, vacate off to the right, and head back towards the parking area. So there you go, guys. I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the Mach Studios F-22A Raptor. Overall, I have to say the aircraft is a very nice effort from the team. If you are looking for a study level rendition of the F-22, then this is not a product for you. But at any rate, you'll probably be waiting another 50 years for one of those to come along. As I often mention in my reviews though, fidelity does not necessarily equal quality. And here, by and large, I think Mach Studios have certainly delivered us a quality product. The F-22 looks really rather good. For the most part, it flies very nicely. Sounds pretty good as well for a Microsoft Flight Simulator jet. Systems fidelity is fairly basic, but there's enough there to enjoy the aircraft. And the thrust vectoring plus the couple of unique features to the aircraft's flight model makes the product a very interesting one for the sim overall. As usual, I'll try and run you through my positives and negatives of the product. Not too many negatives for you here really today. There was really only one aspect of the product that I didn't particularly enjoy. Most of my other negative points are very minor in nature. As we've already talked about, I actually really enjoyed flying the F-22 overall, and it was really impressive as well to see some of the lengths that Mach Studios must have had to go to there to be able to get the aircraft to flat spin and model the thrust vectoring, things of that nature. One area though where the flight model did feel rather iffy was pulling high G loads. There was a lot of buffeting there, which Mach Studios do mention in the manual. Apparently there's a hard-coded issue there with the sim, so there's not a whole lot they can do about it. The buffeting was noticeable, but what really got me was the aircraft actually felt like it was taking bites at the turn as we came through any turns at high G. I think hopefully that was pretty obvious if you watch back the external shots whilst we're carrying out our tail chase. So generally speaking, the F-22 had a very fluid, again very enjoyable flight model, but that did tend to fall apart a little bit, pulling really high load manoeuvres. That is a bit of a shame, as obviously the F-22 is really designed for such manoeuvres, and I imagine they're the sorts of things you're going to be doing with the jet in the sim. Again, I'm not going to lay the blame at Mach Studios' door too much there if they say that the issue is hard-coded into the sim. I wonder though if it isn't possible to mitigate the effect a little bit more there. I certainly don't recall any of the other fast jets that I've flown in the sim having quite as much of an issue at high G. Otherwise though, I guess we're simply waiting for another aerodynamics update within the sim, if indeed Asobo do decide to address the issue. That issue aside though, otherwise I really enjoyed the jet, and as I say, the rest of my negatives are pretty minor. There are just a couple of lower poly areas on the aircraft. The main one that stuck out to me was the boom between the two jet exhausts. I'm not entirely sure what that would be called, but definitely some fairly rough edges there. That could be true to life of the real-world airframe, I'm not entirely sure, but it looked a bit out of place. And the same goes for the texturing, generally very good on the aircraft, but we saw, for example, there the squadron markings, fairly low resolution. And some of the other textures are the same. If you get close enough up to the airframe, they can be a little bit grainy. The texturing issues only seem to be external though. I couldn't find anything in the cockpit really to fault. Aircraft sounds, whilst I certainly wouldn't say they're a negative of the product, it is one of the better sounding fast jets in the sim to date. The F-22 does still lack that feeling of sheer power that you would get from most DCS aircraft, and there was just one or two areas where sounds did seem to be missing. For example, closing up the canopy, there didn't seem to be any associated sounds there. Anyway, that just about wraps up in terms of my negatives. We've already discussed that the jet is lacking in terms of systems fidelity, but once again, I don't think Top Mach Studios is aiming for a study level rendition of the aircraft, and they are reasonably clear about that. You can also download the full product manual ahead of purchasing, so you can get a good feel for yourself of what the aircraft has to offer. Before we move on to my positives, just touching on the frame rate, overall I was getting 61 FPS in the F-22 versus 72 FPS in the default Cessna 152, so dropping about 10-11 frames overall. Pretty good I think given the number of screens available in the cockpit. Moving on to the positives then, and again I think Top Mach Studios have done a very nice job with the F-22 overall. Modelling and texturing generally very good throughout. The cockpit in particular I think looks very nice. All of the instruments, including the HUD, were very easy to read, and the MFDs, whilst fairly simplistic in nature, were fairly configurable, and there was some nice information there. Just enough, I think, to give the illusion that you are flying a highly modern and complex jet fighter. The flight model of the aircraft, again, with the exceptions that we've discussed before, I generally really enjoyed. The F-22 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, and Top Mach Studios have done a pretty nice job of recreating that sort of feel. The aircraft was very easy to fly at both high speed and low speed, and rates of acceleration, deceleration, climb, roll rates all felt pretty reasonable. I haven't demonstrated it here in the video, but the aircraft was capable of Mach 2, and it was also capable of supercruise, i.e. being able to maintain above Mach 1 without the afterburners. So it seems to me that quite a lot of care has gone into the aircraft's flight model, and certainly it seems broadly representative of what one might expect from the Raptor. Thrust vectoring was very cool. It's just a shame that you can't enjoy it quite as much there with all that buffeting at high G. And my favourite piece of flight modelling there, without a doubt, was being able to actually put the aircraft into a flat spin. I thought that was very cool. And again, hats off to Top Mach Studios for being able to pull that one off. Sounds we've already touched on, not up to DCS standards, but still pretty good, and again, one of the better fast jets currently available in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And weapons visually modelled with a weight penalty to the aircraft, so nice to see that's been added. Again though, non-functional, and they won't be included if you purchase the aircraft from the in-sim marketplace. In summary, once again, I think the Top Mach Studios F-22 is a very nice, very high quality product. I would say that it very much sits within the same bracket as India Foxteco products, and whilst the F-22 is a little bit weaker on the systems front compared to say the F-35, overall I think the jet actually has a much better flight model than the Lightning. Anyway, ladies and gents, hopefully that's given you a pretty good feel for what the product has to offer. Once again, if you did find the video useful, then please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It is very much appreciated. I do hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I'll see you all again soon.